History loves a tragedy, but only if it's romantic. We remember the Titanic, the iceberg, the band playing on the open sea. But we have forgotten the ship that killed more passengers than the Titanic without ever leaving the dock. This is the story of the SS Eastland. It was marketed as the Queen of the Lakes, a floating palace of polished wood and velvet curtains. But beneath the luxury, it was a machine fighting a losing war against physics. On a calm summer morning, under a clear blue sky, the golden age of industry met the cold reality of greed. It wasn't a storm that took them. It was a slow, quiet, mathematical certainty. How does a ship die while tied to the pier? And why did an entire city conspire to erase the memory? Tonight, we are going deep into the archives. We are going to reconstruct the decisions, the denials, and the horrifying 3 minutes that changed a city forever. So, turn down the lights, settle in, and subscribe if you believe the past deserves to be heard. Let's uncover the weight of the Eastland. The water of the Chicago River is not deep. In the heart of the city, between the steel canyons of the Loop and the warehouses that line the banks, the river is a sluggish, heavy thing. It moves slowly, thick with the runoff of a metropolis that, in 1915, was the smoking, pounding industrial engine of the American Midwest. In some places, near the docks, if a man were to stand on the bottom of the riverbed, the surface might only reach his chest. It is a river of commerce, not a river of mystery. It is narrow, it is contained, it is domesticated, and yet it is here, in this tame, shallow stretch of water, that a tragedy of impossible scale lies waiting. It is not waiting in the deep Atlantic, where icebergs drift in the black silence. It is not waiting in the gale-force winds of a tropical typhoon. It is waiting 20 feet from a dry, wooden wharf, on a morning so calm that the smoke from the tugboats rises in a perfect, unbroken vertical line. The story of the SS Eastland is not a story of the sea. It is a story of the land. It is a story of gravity and the strange, quiet war that engineers wage against it. But more than that, it is a story of a specific kind of blindness, the kind of blindness that settles over a city and over a corporation when money is flowing and the machinery is working. It is the story of how 844 people can lose their lives without ever leaving the dock. To understand the end, we must understand the beginning. We must go back to a time when the idea of the excursion was a new and intoxicating religion. At the turn of the 20th century, Chicago was a city of hard labor. It was the hog butcher to the world, the stacker of wheat, the player with railroads. Men and women worked 6 days a week, 10, 12 hours a day, in heat and noise that modern minds can scarcely imagine. For these people, the water was the escape. Lake Michigan was not just a geographic feature, it was a promise. It was fresh air. It was silence. It was cool wind. And to get to that promise, you needed a ship. This was the age of the floating palace. The excursion steamers were not merely transport, they were cathedrals of leisure. They were painted a brilliant, blinding white to stand out against the grey soot of the city. They had ballrooms with polished oak floors. They had steam calliopes that sang to the crowds. They had dining salons with velvet curtains and brass fixtures that gleamed under electric lights. They were designed to make a factory worker feel, for one afternoon, like a king. But beneath the velvet and the white paint, these ships were businesses. They were fiercely competitive machines designed to carry the maximum number of paying customers at the lowest possible cost. And in 1902, the Michigan Steamship Company wanted a new machine. They wanted a ship that was fast. They wanted a ship that was elegant. But most importantly, they wanted a ship that could navigate the shallow, tricky harbors of the Great Lakes. They needed a vessel with a shallow draft, a ship that sat high in the water, skimming the surface rather than cutting deep into it. They commissioned the Jenks Shipbuilding Company to build the Eastland. And right there in the first strokes of the draftsman's pen, the ghost entered the machine. To make the ship fast, she was built narrow. To make her capable of entering shallow rivers, she was built with a flat bottom and no keel. She was sleek like a greyhound, but she was intended to carry the load of an ox. From the moment her steel ribs were laid in the dry dock, the mathematics of her existence were fighting against her. Ships are governed by a center of gravity. It is the invisible point around which the vessel pivots. If that center is low, deep in the hull, the ship is like a weeble-wobble toy. No matter how hard you push it, it violently wants to stand back up. It fights the sea to stay upright. But the Eastland was different. Her hull was shallow, her engines were heavy. And then the owners began to pile things on top. Decks for walking, cabins for sleeping, smokestacks that reached for the sky. The center of gravity crept upward, inch by inch, escaping the safety of the hull and rising into the superstructure. When a ship is top-heavy, it becomes lazy. That is the sailor's term. A stable ship rolls with a wave and snaps back quickly. A top-heavy ship rolls and pauses. It hangs there, suspended, thinking about whether or not it wants to return to center. The Eastland was born lazy. She was launched in May of 1903. It should have been a celebration. The champagne bottle smashed, the crowds cheered, the whistle blew. But almost immediately, the ship began to whisper her secret. On her very first season, she didn't feel right. She moved through the water with a strange, slippery grace, sensitive to every shift in weight. If the passengers all moved to the port side to wave at a passing boat, the Eastland would lean with them. And she would stay there. She wouldn't fight back. The crew knew sailors are creatures of instinct. They feel the vibration of the deck through the soles of their boots. They knew this ship was tender. They knew she had a nervous disposition. But in 1903, safety was not a science. It was a negotiation. Instead of taking the ship back to dry dock, instead of widening her hull or stripping away the heavy upper decks, the operators invented a workaround. It was a crude, manual solution to a physics problem. When the ship listed to one side, the crew would open valves and pump water into ballast tanks on the opposite side to balance her out. It was a reactive system. It relied on men watching the horizon, feeling the tilt, and turning a wheel. It relied on speed. It relied on the hope that the ship wouldn't tilt faster than the pumps could fill the tanks. And when the pumps weren't enough, they used the passengers. It became a routine part of an afternoon on the Eastland. The ship would lean, the rail dipping precariously close to the water, and the captain would shout down from the bridge. The crew would circulate among the women in their long skirts, and the men in their boaters, asking them, politely but firmly, to please move to the other side of the deck. Trim the ship, they called it. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of people laughing, holding their hats, shuffling across the sloped wooden deck like cattle, thinking it was part of the adventure. They were human ballast. They were correcting a structural failure with their own bodies, and because it worked, because the ship always came back up, eventually, the danger began to feel normal. This is the most dangerous phase in the life of any disaster. It is the normalization of deviance. When you survive a risk once, you respect it. When you survive it 100 times, you ignore it. The Eastland became known as a cranky ship, a leaner. It was a quirk of her personality, not a death sentence written in steel. But the reputation followed her. By the end of her first season, there were rumors. People whispered that she was unsafe. The owners, terrified of losing their investment, launched a publicity campaign. They ran advertisements in the newspapers. They offered a prize, $5,000, a fortune in those days, to anyone who could prove the Eastland was not seaworthy. It was a bluff. They knew no one could prove it without sinking her. And so the public, hungry for the lake, hungry for the escape, chose to believe the advertisements. They chose to believe the shiny white paint. Years passed. The Eastland changed hands. She was sold and sold again. She moved from South Haven to Cleveland and finally back to Chicago. With every sale, the new owners looked at the books, saw the potential for profit, and ignored the whispers. But they didn't just ignore the warnings, they made the problem worse. This is where the tragedy shifts from a story of bad design to a story of human greed. In the early 20th century, the excursion business was cutthroat. To compete, you needed to offer more dining, more dancing, more comfort. The new owners looked at the Eastland and saw wasted space. They saw open decks that could be enclosed to protect passengers from the rain. They saw areas where heavy oak benches could be installed. They saw room for concrete flooring to make the galley easier to clean. Wait. Every renovation added tons of material to the ship, and almost all of that weight was added high up, above the waterline. They laid concrete on the upper decks. They installed heavy davits. They added layers of paint and wood and glass. With every nail driven into the superstructure, the center of gravity rose higher. The metacentric height, the mathematical margin of safety that keeps a ship upright, shrank. It became a razor-thin line. The ship was no longer just lazy, she was unstable. She was a pencil balancing on its tip, held in place only by the friction of the water and the constant vigilance of the crew below decks, sweating over the ballast pumps. The engineers saw it. There were letters. There were reports. Inspectors from the steamboat service would come aboard, walk the decks and frown. They would note the list. They would note the heavy additions. But regulation, in those days, was a paper tiger. The inspectors were often men who had come up in the industry. They knew the owners. They knew the pressure to keep the commerce moving. To ground a ship like the Eastland during the height of the summer season would cost thousands of dollars. It would ruin the company, it would anger the public. So the reports were filed, the certificates were signed. The inspectors convinced themselves that as long as the crew was careful, as long as the ballast was managed, the ship was safe enough. Safe enough is the phrase that paves the road to the graveyard. In 1913, another modification was made. It was small, seemingly insignificant. The calliope, the steam organ, was moved. Ventilation systems were altered. The stack height was adjusted. It was tinkering. But the Eastland was a system at its limit. By 1915, the ship had returned to Chicago, the city of her birth. She was now owned by the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company. She was the jewel of their fleet. She was marketed as the speed queen of the Great Lakes. But the men who worked in the engine room knew the truth. They knew that when they turned the ship, she swung wide and heeled over hard. They knew that if the coal bunkers weren't balanced perfectly, she would list at the dock. They knew that they were walking a tightrope. There is a specific feeling aboard a ship that is tender. It is a feeling of unease that permeates the subconscious. When you walk down a corridor, you find yourself putting a hand out to the wall, bracing for a roll that hasn't happened yet. The coffee in the cup sits at a slight angle. The doors swing shut with a little too much force. The Eastland had become a vessel of tension. And then history intervened. Far away, in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, the Titanic had gone down 3 years earlier. The world had been horrified by the lack of lifeboats. The cry had gone up from the newspapers and the pulpits. Boats for all. The public demanded that every single passenger have a seat in a lifeboat. Congress listened. The Seamen's Act was signed into law. It was a noble piece of legislation, written with the best of intentions. It mandated that ships like the Eastland carry enough lifeboats and rafts for everyone on board. But the lawmakers in Washington did not understand the physics of the Eastland. They did not understand that safety is a balance, not a list of inventory. To comply with the law, the owners of the Eastland ordered more lifeboats. Heavy wooden lifeboats. And where could they go? There was no room on the lower decks. They had to go on the very top. They installed them on the hurricane deck, the highest point of the ship. Tons of timber, steel and supplies were bolted to the roof of a structure that was already groaning under its own weight. It was the final straw. The law that was meant to save lives had just signed the death warrants of 800 people. It had taken a ship that was marginally stable and turned it into a loaded weapon. The engineers looked at the new boats. They looked at the concrete decks. They looked at the ballast logs. They surely felt the cold knot of dread in their stomachs. But the summer season was beginning. The tickets were sold. The Western Electric Company had chartered the ship for their massive employee picnic. 7,000 tickets had been distributed. The Eastland, along with 4 other steamers, was scheduled to take the workers and their families across the lake for a day of celebration. It was to be the biggest event of the year. For the immigrant families who worked at the Western Electric plant, the Poles, the Bohemians, the Germans, the Hungarians, this was their holiday. They had saved for new clothes. They had prepared picnic baskets with roasted chickens and sausages and rye bread. They had scrubbed their children's faces and combed their hair. They did not know about metacentric height. They did not know about the concrete on the upper decks. They did not know about the ballast pumps. They only knew that the Eastland was big and white and beautiful. They trusted the ship because it was there. They trusted it because the government said it was safe. They trusted it because they wanted to believe in the day off. The date was set. July 24, 1915. The ship lay at the dock on the south side of the Chicago River between Clark and LaSalle Streets. The crew arrived early to prepare the beast. The fires were stoked in the boilers. The coal was shoveled. The steam pressure began to build. In the pre-dawn darkness, the Eastland looked solid. She looked like a permanent part of the city. The water of the river lapped gently against her steel skin, dark and oily. The chief engineer, Joseph Erickson, was down below. He was a man who knew the ship's temper. He checked the ballast tanks. He knew that loading passengers would be tricky. As the people came aboard, the weight would shift. He would have to dance with the valves, filling and emptying the tanks to keep her level. It was a routine he had performed 100 times. But today, the load would be heavy. The capacity was 2,500 passengers, and they would all be coming at once. Above him, on the bridge, Captain Harry Peterson paced. He was a stern man, a company man. He was worried about the schedule. He was worried about the tugboat usage. He was not thinking about catastrophe. He was thinking about logistics. The sun began to rise over the city. The sky was a pale, clear blue. It was going to be a perfect day, a hot day. The kind of day that makes the cool breeze of the lake feel like a benediction. On the wharf, the first families began to arrive. They came by streetcar and by foot. They carried hampers and babies. The mood was electric. There was music in the air, the smell of coal smoke mixed with the smell of perfume and summer dust. They looked up at the Eastland, towering above them. The gangplank was lowered. It was a bridge between the solid earth and the floating palace. One by one they stepped onto the wood. They did not feel the ship shudder. They did not feel the subtle shift as the steel hull adjusted to their weight. They simply walked aboard, climbing the stairs, heading for the upper decks to get the best view. They were climbing a mountain that was already crumbling. They were adding their own weight, 100 pounds, 150 pounds, 40 pounds for a child, to the equation that was waiting to solve itself. The grand ambition was complete. The ship was full. The machine was running. And the river, the shallow, silent river, waited. To understand the weight of the Eastland, you have to look away from Chicago for a moment. You have to look 3 years into the past, to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. When the Titanic went down, it didn't just break a ship. It broke the world's confidence. The idea that technology had conquered nature was shattered, and in the aftermath, the pendulum swung violently from arrogance to paranoia. The public outcry was deafening. Boats for all. It became a chant, a political slogan, a moral imperative. If a ship carried 2,000 souls, it must carry 2,000 seats in lifeboats. It was a simple, logical demand. It was written into the Seamen's Act with the ink of righteous anger. But laws are written on paper, and ships are written in steel. The Eastland was built in 1903, nearly a decade before this new mandate. She was designed for speed, for shallow water, for grace. She was not designed to carry a fleet of smaller ships on her back. Yet, in the spring of 1915, that is exactly what happened. Workers hauled heavy oak lifeboats up the narrow gangways. They installed massive steel davits, the cranes used to lower the boats, onto the highest deck. They lashed rafts to the roof of the wheelhouse. Consider the physics of a lever. If you hold a hammer by the handle, it's light. If you hold it by the head and extend the handle out, the weight multiplies. The Eastland was the handle. The lifeboats were the hammerhead, and they were placing them as far away from the center of gravity as possible. These were not the lightweight fiberglass shells of today. These were timber and iron. They soaked up rain. They held dew. They were heavy, dead weight. And they sat there, high above the river, waiting. It is one of history's cruelest ironies. The very equipment installed to save the passengers was the primary weapon gathering strength to kill them. But the danger wasn't just above. It was below. Deep in the belly of the ship, in the hot, dark, oily world of the engine room, there was a different struggle. Here the logic was not about regulations, it was about survival. The chief engineer, Joseph Erickson, was the man responsible for the unseen war against the ship's nature. Erickson knew the Eastland was a tender ship. He knew she had no keel to keep her straight. She relied entirely on ballast tanks, compartments in the bottom of the hull that could be filled with river water to weigh her down. Imagine a system of cavernous steel rooms beneath your feet. When the ship leans left, you pump water into the right. When she leans right, you pump water into the left. It sounds simple. But the pumps were slow. They were steam-driven, rhythmic, plodding machines. They could move tons of water, but they took minutes to do it. A listing ship does not wait for minutes. To make matters worse, there was the free surface effect. When a tank is only half full, the water inside it sloshes. If the ship tilts, that water rushes to the low side, pushing the weight exactly where you don't want it. It's like trying to carry a wide, shallow pan of water across a room without spilling it. The water wants to throw you off balance. Ericsson and his black gang, the men covered in coal dust and grease, lived in this reality. They were the invisible workforce. While the officers on the bridge stood in their clean white uniforms, staring at the skyline, the men below were watching water gauges and shouting over the roar of the furnaces. They were the ones who felt the sickness of the ship first. They felt the floor tilting under their boots, not as a gentle sway, but as a reluctance. On the morning of July 24th, the system was about to be overwhelmed. It is 6:30 in the morning. The city is waking up. The air is already warm, thick with the humidity that rises off the Midwest cornfields and settles into the river valley. The sun cuts through the haze, turning the Chicago River a muddy gold. At the dock, the crowd is swelling. This is the Western Electric picnic. In 1915, Western Electric is more than a company. It is a city within a city. Its massive Hawthorne Works plant employs tens of thousands of people. For many of the immigrants who work there, the Poles from the South Side, the Bohemians from Pilsen, this job is their ticket to the American middle class. And this picnic is the crown jewel of their year. They arrive in waves, families of 5, 6, 7. The men are wearing their Sunday best, heavy wool suits, high stiff collars that chafe the neck, straw boater hats. The women are in floor-length muslin dresses, corseted, wearing wide-brimmed hats pinned to their hair. The children are miniatures of their parents, scrubbed pink, holding tight to hands and picnic baskets. They are carrying weight, hampers full of food, glass bottles of lemonade and beer, cameras, umbrellas, and they are carrying the weight of expectation. This is a day to be seen, a day to relax, a day to prove that the hard work in the factory has paid off. They funnel toward the gangplank. It is a choke point. A ticket taker stands there counting, click, click, click. Every person who steps aboard adds £150 to the equation. And they don't just sit down. They explore. They are excited. They rush to the upper decks to wave at friends still on the dock. They cluster on the side of the ship, facing the wharf, because that's where the action is. The ship begins to react immediately. At 6:40 a.m., with nearly 1,000 people aboard, the Eastland tilts. She leans toward the dock, toward the weight of the crowd. It's a noticeable list, maybe 10 degrees. Down in the engine room, Ericsson sees the inclinometer move. He barks an order. Open the port side ballast tanks. Let the river in. Counteract the weight. The pumps chug, the water flows. Slowly, the ship rights herself. She comes back to even. Up on the bridge, Captain Peterson is annoyed. He is a man obsessed with the clock. He wants to depart on time. He sees the list not as a warning, but as a nuisance. He trusts Ericsson to handle it. He trusts the pumps. But the passengers keep coming. They are pouring over the gangplank now, a river of humanity flowing into the steel container. By 7 o'clock, the capacity is nearly reached. 2,500 people. The ship is packed. Every deck is a sea of straw hats and white fabric. The mood is raucous. A band begins to play ragtime music on the promenade deck. The brass notes float out over the water, bright and frantic. Then the dynamic shifts. The passengers, having waved to their friends on the dock, begin to settle. Or perhaps something catches their eye on the riverside. Or perhaps the sun is too hot on the wharf side. The crowd begins to drift toward the port side, away from the dock, toward the open river. The Eastland feels the shift. She is agonizingly sensitive now. Her draft has deepened with the weight of the people, but her center of gravity is dangerously high. She rolls away from the dock. She lists to port. It is 7:10 a.m. The list is sharp. Dishes slide across the tables in the dining salon. In the pantry, a refrigerator door swings open. On the dance floor, people laugh and grab the railings, treating it like a funhouse ride. Whoa, they say, steady on. Down below, Ericsson is sweating. He just filled the starboard tanks to fix the first list. Now the ship is leaning the other way. He has to reverse everything. Empty the starboard tanks. Fill the port tanks. He is chasing the bubble in the level, but the bubble is moving faster than his pumps. And he has a problem. The ship is so heavy now that the waterline is rising. The intake valves for the ballast tanks are deep underwater, which is good for bringing water in, but to empty a tank you have to pump water out against the pressure of the river. It is slow work. The list to port stabilizes, but the ship does not come back to center. She hangs there, listing about 10 degrees toward the river. On the dock, the harbour master notices. He shouts up to the bridge, "She's listing, Captain!" Captain Peterson waves him off. He is focused on the stern line. He is focused on the tugboat, the Kenosha, which is waiting to pull them out. To him, a list is just a loading issue. It will sort itself out once they get moving. The forward motion of the ship, the flow of water over the rudder, that usually stabilizes a vessel. He just wants to get underway. The lines are singled up. The gangplank is pulled in. The connection to the land is severed. Now the Eastland is truly alone. She is a self-contained system, and the system is failing. Inside the cabins, the air is getting stuffy. Women fan themselves. Babies are crying in the heat. The smell of the river, a mix of sewage and stockyard runoff, wafts through the open portholes, and those portholes are getting very close to the water. This is a critical detail. The Eastland had a row of gangway doors and portholes on her lower deck, just a few feet above the waterline. On a normal day, they were safe, but today, the ship is sitting low, and she is leaning. The crew has been instructed to close them, but it is hot, and there is no central authority walking the decks, checking every latch. Some are closed, some are open. Some are half open to let in a breeze. 7:20 a.m. the band plays on. The melody is "I'm on my way to Mandalay." It is an upbeat, bouncing tune. The passengers are shoulder to shoulder. The ship feels solid beneath them because it is huge. It is made of steel. It feels like a building. But a building has a foundation. The Eastland has only water. The list increases. It is not a sudden jerk. It is a slow, sickening glide. 12 degrees, 14 degrees. On the promenade deck, a picnic basket slides across the floor and hits the railing. A woman laughs, nervous now. A few men stop talking and look at the horizon. The horizon is tilted. Below decks, in the engine room, the warnings are no longer subtle. The floor is slanted so steeply that the stokers have trouble shoveling coal. The wheelbarrows roll away from them. Ericsson shouts for the pumps to run full capacity. He is trying to blow the water out of the high side, trying to pull the ship back. But the passengers are the variable he can't control. As the ship leans to port toward the river, gravity pulls the people that way too. They slide, they stumble, and even if they don't fall, they instinctively brace themselves against the lower railing. Weight begets weight. The crowd shifts to the low side, which pushes the ship further, which makes it harder to climb back up. It is a feedback loop. 7:25 a.m. The tugboat Kenosha blows its whistle. It is time. The stern line is cast off. The Eastland is technically floating free, held only by a bowline. The water of the Chicago River laps at the lower gangway doors. It is dark, greasy water. It touches the lip of the threshold. And then, quietly, it begins to spill inside. It enters the engine room first, trickling down vents and open hatches. It enters the lower cabins. This is the moment the mathematics run out. This is the moment the metacentric height hits zero. There is no longer any force trying to right the ship. The Weeble-Wobble toy has lost its weight. It is just a shell waiting to fall. The list reaches 20 degrees. Now the panic begins. Not a scream, not yet. But a silence, a sudden suspension of breath. On the upper deck, the folding chairs start to slide. Hundreds of them. They clatter against the port railing, stacking up in a jumble of wood and limbs. A refrigerator behind the bar crashes over, smashing bottles. The piano in the grand salon slides across the polished floor and slams into the wall. The sound reverberates through the hull like a gunshot. People grab for support, they grab pillars, they grab each other, they grab the railings. "Move to the starboard side," someone screams. "Move back!" But you cannot climb a hill that is moving. The deck is becoming a wall. Down in the engine room, the lights flicker. The water is rising around the boilers. The men of the black gang drop their shovels. They look at the ladders. The ladders are twisted at a crazy angle. The exit is up, but up is shifting sideways. Captain Peterson, on the bridge, grips the wheel. He is shouting at the tugboat, he is shouting at his crew. But the ship is no longer listening to him. The ship is listening only to the river. 7:27 a.m. The list passes 25 degrees. The water pours into the lower portholes not as a trickle, but as a deluge. The river is claiming the space where the air used to be. The Eastland stops rolling for a second. It pauses. It hangs there, suspended in a terrifying equilibrium. The passengers freeze. The band stops playing. The city falls silent. For one heartbeat, it seems possible that she might stay there. That this is just a terrible mistake, a scare, a story to tell later. But the water is inside now. The ballast is useless. The lifeboats on the top deck, the heavy mandated lifeboats, surrender to gravity. They pull the top of the ship down. The pause ends. The ship does not sink. She does not plunge. She rotates. And the world turns sideways. It happens in silence, and then in a roar. When a ship the size of a city block decides to die, it does not negotiate. The final roll of the Eastland took less than 60 seconds. In the time it takes to tie a shoelace or pour a cup of coffee, the world rotated 90 degrees. Physics is a dispassionate executioner. As the list passed 45 degrees, the friction that held people to the floor vanished. The deck became a slide, the wall became a floor, the ceiling became a trap. 2,500 people did not fall into the water. They fell into the machine. On the upper decks, the horror was open air. Women in heavy skirts slid down the steep wooden incline, crashing into the railing, into the benches, into each other. They tumbled into the river in a tangled mass of white linen and terrified screams. The water churned, instantly thick with bodies, hats, and debris. But inside the ship, the horror was hermetic. Imagine standing in a ballroom. The band is playing, the floor is polished wood. Suddenly, the floor tilts up. You reach for a pillar, but your grip slips. You fall. But you don't fall down. You fall sideways. You slide across the width of the room. And sliding with you are hundreds of other people. Sliding with you are the heavy oak tables, the iron chairs, the grand piano. They all crashed into the port side wall, which was now the bottom of a deep steel canyon. The people arrived first. The furniture arrived second. The sound was described by survivors not as a scream, but as a grinding crash, like a building collapsing from the inside out. And then the water entered. It did not rush in like a tide. It exploded in through the open gangways and the shattered windows. The Chicago River, cold and brown, filled the lower compartments in seconds. The lights shorted out. Darkness swallowed the screams. The ship settled on her side in the mud of the riverbed. She lay there, half submerged, like a great white whale harpooned in the shallows. Because the river was only 20 feet deep and the ship was 40 feet wide, the starboard side, the side that had been facing the dock, remained high and dry, rising above the surface like a steel island. For those on the starboard railing, it was a simple matter of climbing over the side and walking onto the hull. They stood there blinking in the morning sun, their shoes dry, looking down at the river just a few feet away. But for those inside, the nightmare had geometry. The ship was now a labyrinth turned on its side. Corridors were vertical shafts. Doorways were holes in the ceiling or the floor. Staircases were useless overhangs. In the first few minutes, the air was filled with a sound that haunted Chicago for a generation. It was the sound of air escaping. Great bubbles of trapped oxygen burped from the hull, fighting their way to the surface. And mixed with the hissing of the air were the cries of the trapped. They were so close. That is the detail that breaks the mind. They were 20 feet from the wharf. A man standing on the dock could throw a baseball and hit the hull. The streetcars were still running on the bridge nearby. The city was right there. But the steel plates of the hull were half an inch thick, and behind those plates, hundreds of people were suffocating in air pockets or drowning in the dark. Rescuers arrived immediately, but they arrived into chaos. This was not a rescue. It was a siege. Firemen, policemen, and dock workers rushed to the river's edge. They saw the white hull rising from the water. They heard the tapping from inside. Tap, 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 the rhythm of the desperate. Men with axes jumped onto the side of the ship. They began to hack at the steel, but axes bounce off rivets. They needed torches. They needed oxyacetylene cutters. It took time to find the welders. It took time to bring the tanks. Minutes ticked by. Inside the hull, the water level was rising, compressing the air, squeezing the lungs of the survivors. When the torches finally arrived, the blue flames hissed against the white paint. The metal glowed cherry red, then white, then melted. The rescuers cut holes in the side of the ship, square, jagged windows into the tomb. When the first hole was opened, the pressure released with a sickening whoosh. Hands reached out of the darkness, white, desperate hands. The rescuers pulled them out one by one. A woman, a child, a man with his clothes torn off by the struggle. But for every hand they grabbed, there were 10 they couldn't reach. The geography of the ship dictated the survival rate. If you were on the top deck, you got wet. If you were in the middle decks, you had a chance. If you were in the lower cabins, in the bar or the deeper dining salons, you were gone. The Western Electric picnic had become a mass grave. The scene on the river became a grotesque tableau of the industrial age. The river was clogged with the detritus of leisure. Picnic baskets floated alongside straw hats. A drum from the band bobbed in the current, and everywhere bodies. They were pulled onto the wharf and laid in rows. The sheer number of them overwhelmed the senses. It wasn't a tragedy of individuals anymore, it was a tragedy of volume. The police ran out of blankets, they ran out of stretchers, they began to flag down passing delivery trucks and wagons. "Take them," they told the drivers, "just take them." The 2nd Regiment Armory on Washington Boulevard was converted into a temporary morgue. It was a cavernous hall usually smelling of gun oil and sweat. Now it smelled of river water and death. By noon, the bodies were stacked in lines that stretched the length of the floor. 844 people. More passengers died on the Eastland than on the Titanic. 22 whole families were wiped out. Father, mother, children, all gone. The silence in the armory was heavier than the noise at the river. Relatives walked down the aisles, lifting sheets, looking for a familiar face, a scar, a ring, a favorite dress. The sound of weeping echoed off the high rafters, a constant low-frequency hum of grief. But outside the armory, the grief was already turning into something else. It was turning into rage. Chicago was a city of unions, of socialists, of hard-nosed newspapermen. They looked at the river, at the calm water, at the clear sky, and they knew this was not an act of God. God sends storms. God sends lightning. God does not make a ship fall over at the dock. This was a crime. The investigation began before the last body was pulled from the mud. The coroner's jury was convened. The federal inspectors arrived. And immediately, the great machine of deflection began to spin. The captain, Harry Pedersen, was arrested. The police had to hide him. The crowd on the dock wanted to lynch him. He sat in a cell, sullen and defensive. He blamed the passengers. "They wouldn't stay still," he said. "They all rushed to the side." The chief engineer, Joseph Erickson, blamed the system. "The ballast tanks," he said. "They weren't fast enough. The listing was inevitable." The owners, the men of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, blamed the government. "We were following the law," they said. "The government made us add the lifeboats. The government inspected the ship. We have the certificates." And the government? The federal inspectors who had signed off on the Eastland stability for years. They blamed the unseen. They spoke of mysterious conditions in the river. They suggested pilings on the riverbed might have tripped the ship. It was a circular firing squad of liability. Everyone pointed the finger at the person to their left. But the facts were cold and hard. The ship had been top-heavy. Everyone knew it. The ship had been modified beyond its limits. Everyone knew it. And yet, the system had allowed it to sail. The coroner's jury was furious. They recommended charges of manslaughter. They wanted heads to roll. They wanted the executives of the steamship line to hang. They wanted the federal inspectors to rot in prison. Greed, the prosecutor thundered. Simple, naked greed. But the legal system is a slow creature, much slower than a capsizing ship. The indictments were filed, but the lawyers for the steamship company were expensive and skilled. They argued about jurisdiction. They argued about the definition of seaworthiness. They argued that the tragedy was an unforeseeable accident. They played the long game. They knew that anger burns hot, but it burns out. And history was on their side. In 1915, the world was on fire. Europe was consuming itself in the trenches of the Great War. The United States was teetering on the edge of joining the fight. Just months before the Eastland rolled over, a German U-boat had torpedoed the Lusitania. 1,200 people had died. The Lusitania was an act of war. It was a global event. It had villains with foreign accents. It had the drama of the open ocean. It fit the narrative of a world under attack. The Eastland? The Eastland was a local embarrassment. It was a dirty, gritty, working-class disaster. It involved immigrants with difficult names: Novak, Kowalski, Bernstein. It happened in a dirty river, not the romantic high seas. It was messy, and America hates a mess. So, as the weeks turned into months, the national attention drifted. The headlines shifted back to the Kaiser, back to the price of wheat, back to the war. The Eastland became a Chicago story, then a neighborhood story, then a whisper. And what of the ship itself? Usually, when a ship kills 800 people, it becomes a grave site. It is left alone or it is scrapped with solemnity. But the Eastland was valuable steel. A few weeks after the disaster, salvage crews arrived. They didn't come to mourn. They came to work. They sealed the holes the rescuers had cut. They pumped the water out of the hull. They attached massive pontoons. Slowly, groaning under the strain, the Eastland rose from the mud. She broke the surface, covered in slime, dripping river water. She was righted. She floated again. The sight was macabre. This was the murder weapon. Resurrected. You might expect them to tow it out to the middle of Lake Michigan and sink it as a memorial, or break it apart and melt it down so that the metal could never hurt anyone again. They did neither. The ship was sold. The Navy bought her. They needed transports for the war effort. They stripped her down. They removed the promenade deck, the heavy lifeboats, the funnels. They cut away the top-heavy structures that had doomed her. When they were done, she looked like a different ship. Low, sleek, grey, a gunboat. They renamed her the USS Wilmette. The name Eastland was erased from the bow. The ghost was painted over. The ship that had killed a neighborhood was commissioned into the United States Navy. She served as a training vessel. For 30 years, young sailors walked her decks. They scrubbed the floors where the bodies had been stacked. They slept in the compartments where the families had drowned. Most of them didn't know. Or if they knew, they didn't speak of it. It was bad luck to talk about the dead. The Wilmette sailed the Great Lakes until after World War II. She was a fixture on the horizon, a grey phantom. She carried no passengers, only recruits. She was stable now, safe. Because the luxury was gone, the profit motive was gone. She was purely a machine of war. It wasn't until 1946 that she was finally sent to the scrapyard. She was cut up into pieces in a Chicago yard, not far from where she had capsized. The steel was melted down. It became cars or girders or razor blades. The atoms of the Eastland were scattered into the infrastructure of the 20th century. But the lack of consequence remained. The legal battles dragged on for 20 years. 20 years of appeals, motions, and delays. By the time the final ruling came down, the original owners were dead or bankrupt. The steamship company was gone. The court's final decision was a masterpiece of legal cynicism. It ruled that the owners were not liable for the deaths because they had not personally known about the ship's instability. They were just businessmen, the court said. They weren't engineers. How could they have known? It was the ultimate exoneration of the boardroom. As long as you don't ask the question, you can't be blamed for the answer. The victims' families received nothing, or next to nothing. The payout, after decades of fighting, amounted to mere pennies on the dollar for each life lost. The Western Electric Company, for its part, tried to move on. The picnic was cancelled for a few years, then reinstated. The factory kept humming. The telephones kept being built. The immigrants kept working. They buried their dead in the sprawling cemeteries on the outskirts of Chicago, Bohemian National St. Adalbert's. The tombstones bear the same date, July 24th, 1915. You can walk through the rows and see them, father, mother, daughter, son, all the same day. But in the city itself, the memory began to fade. There was no great monument erected at the river. There was no national holiday. The plaque that marks the site today is small, easily missed by the tourists walking along the riverwalk. It is a disaster that history tried to swallow. But memory is like the water in the ballast tanks. You can try to pump it out, you can try to suppress it, but it finds a way to slosh back, it finds a way to destabilize the present. Because the Eastland was not just a freak accident, it was a prototype. It was a warning that went unheeded. It demonstrated a fundamental truth about complex systems, that safety is often an illusion created by paperwork, and that catastrophe is patient. The ship was gone. The lawsuits were closed. The war was over. The jazz age arrived. Chicago boomed. The skyscrapers grew taller, digging their foundations deep into the clay. The river flowed backwards, reversed by engineers to keep the lake clean. Everything was under control. Everything was modern. Everything was safe. But those who lived by the river knew better. They knew that the Eastland wasn't really gone. You can rename a ship, but you cannot exercise the gravity. You can paint over the steel, but you cannot paint over the sorrow. And sometimes on quiet mornings when the mist is rising off the Chicago River and the city is asleep, you can still feel it, a heavy lethargic presence in the water, a hesitation in the current, the feeling of a machine that is waiting to fall. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a disaster of this magnitude. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of suppression. For the families of the Western Electric employees, life did not stop. In 1915, there was no concept of post-traumatic stress disorder. There were no grief counselors dispatched to the schools. There was only the rent which was due on the 1st. There was only the shift at the factory which began at 7 a.m. The Monday after the disaster, the machinery at the Hawthorne Works plant was turned back on. The assembly lines began to move. But there were gaps in the line, stations where a man used to stand, twisting copper wire, stools where a woman used to sit, winding coils. The company filled those spots quickly. They had to. The telephones were in high demand. The war in Europe was consuming raw materials and communication equipment. The machine of industry could not pause for the machine of death. And so the survivors went back to work. They walked past the empty lockers of their friends. They ate lunch in the same halls where, days before, they had excitedly planned the picnic. They worked alongside the ghosts of the Eastland, and they did not talk about it. This was the era of the stiff upper lip. To speak of the tragedy was seen as a weakness, or worse, as bad luck. It was a trauma swallowed whole. But trauma, like the water in the hull, finds a place to settle. It settled in the homes of the Polish and Czech neighborhoods. It settled in the living rooms where portraits were turned to face the wall. It settled in the fear of water that was passed down irrationally, from mother to daughter, from father to son. There are stories of children in Chicago born decades later who were forbidden from learning to swim. They didn't know why. They only knew that the water was an enemy. They didn't know their grandfather had watched his sister slip beneath the brown surface of the river. They only knew the rule: stay on dry land. The Eastland became a phantom limb of the city. It was felt but not seen. And while the families tried to forget, the ship itself refused to vanish. As the USS Wilmette, it patrolled the lakes for another 30 years. It is one of the strangest footnotes in maritime history. The ship that capsized due to instability became a training vessel for the U.S. Navy. Thousands of young sailors learned the ropes on her decks. They scrubbed the very planks where the picnic baskets had slid. They slept in hammocks slung in the spaces where the bodies had been piled. Did they feel it? Did the ship feel heavy to them? Or had the Navy, in its ruthless efficiency, stripped away the ghosts along with the promenade deck? By 1946, the Wilmette was obsolete. She was towed to a scrapyard on the south branch of the Chicago River. The torches were lit once again. This time, they didn't cut holes to save lives. They cut the steel to sell it. The metal was melted down. It was recycled. It is possible, even probable, that the steel of the Eastland exists today in the rebar of a Chicago skyscraper, or the body of a vintage automobile, or the casing of a washing machine. The atoms of the tragedy were scattered into the mundane objects of American life. But if the steel is gone, the question remains: why don't we remember? Ask an average American to name a shipwreck. They will say Titanic. They might say Lusitania. They will almost never say Eastland. Why? The death toll of passengers on the Eastland was higher than on the Titanic. The horror was just as absolute. The answer lies in the nature of the story we tell ourselves. The Titanic is a mythic tragedy. It happened on the high seas, in the middle of the night under a star-filled sky. It involved the richest people in the world, Astor, Guggenheim, Strauss. It had an iceberg, a villain sent by nature. It had a band playing Nearer, My God, to Thee. It was hubris punished by the gods. It was a Greek tragedy in dinner jackets. The Eastland was a gritty industrial accident. It happened in a dirty river, in broad daylight, 10 feet from the dock. The victims were not millionaires, they were factory workers. They were immigrants. Their names were hard to pronounce. They died not in a noble struggle against the ocean, but in a chaotic, humiliating pile of furniture and sewage. There is no romance in the Eastland. There is no Celine Dion song. There is no heroism in drowning inside a capsized metal box while the city watches from the bridge. The Titanic confirms our bias that nature is dangerous. The Eastland confronts us with a darker truth, that we are dangerous, that our systems, our greed, and our compromises are more deadly than any iceberg. We remember the Titanic because it feels like bad luck. We forgot the Eastland because it feels like bad management, and that is why the Eastland matters more. In the 21st century, we have revisited the physics of the ship. Modern naval architects have fed the blueprints of the Eastland into supercomputers. They have reconstructed the hull forms, the weight distribution, the ballast capacity. The computer models are chilling. They show that the disaster was not a freak occurrence, it was not a mystery. It was a mathematical certainty. The simulations show that with the ballast tanks empty and the passengers loaded, the ship had a metacentric height of mere inches. In some loading conditions, it was negative. That means the ship was already unstable before the ropes were even cast off. The computer shows the ship rolling. It shows that once the list passed 10 degrees, there was no force in the universe that could have brought her back. The pumps were too slow. The center of gravity was too high. The laws of physics had been violated, and the penalty was immediate execution. This modern analysis strips away the excuses of the time. It proves that the captain wasn't just unlucky. It proves that the owners weren't just victims of circumstance. It proves that the regulators who signed the certificates were looking at a death trap and calling it safe. It is a case study in what sociologists call the normalization of deviance. This concept was made famous after the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. It describes a culture where small safety violations are tolerated because nothing bad happened last time. The Eastland listed in 1904. Nothing happened. So they accepted it. It listed in 1912. Nothing happened. So they added more decks. It listed in 1914. Nothing happened. So they added concrete floors. Each time the ship survived, the engineers and owners falsely believed they were safe. They mistook luck for competence. They believed they could negotiate with gravity. We still do this. Look at our modern world. We see it in crumbling bridges that are inspected and marked structurally deficient, but left open because closing them would be inconvenient. We see it in financial systems that are leveraged to the hilt, balanced on a razor's edge of risk, approved by regulators who assume the market will correct itself. We see it in industrial accidents, where the warning signs were logged in reports for years, but ignored because fixing them would cost too much. The Eastland is not a story about a boat in 1915. It is a story about the breaking point of systems. It is a story about the moment when good enough stops being good enough. It teaches us that safety is not a permanent state. It is a perishable commodity. It must be renewed every day. The moment you assume you are safe because you were safe yesterday, you are in danger. Today, if you go to the Chicago River between Clark and LaSalle streets, you will find a different city. The smoke and the grime are gone. The warehouses have been converted into luxury apartments. The Riverwalk is lined with wine bars and kayak rentals. The water is cleaner, though still opaque. There is a memorial there. It was dedicated recently after decades of anonymity. It is a modest section of the wall, etched with the story. It is easy to walk past it without noticing. But if you stop, and if you lean over the railing, You are looking at the grave. The space is small, that is what strikes you. The river is so narrow here. You can hear the conversations of people walking on the other side. It seems impossible that a ship could turn over here and not simply hit the other bank. It seems impossible that 800 people could die in a space that feels like a swimming pool. But the water does not care about our incredulity. Stand there for a moment, close your eyes, listen to the city, the rumble of the L train, the sirens, the chatter of tourists. Strip it away. Imagine the smell of coal smoke. Imagine the sound of a ragtime band playing a happy tune. Imagine the sudden, terrible silence when the music stops. The Eastland was a machine built for pleasure that became a machine of sorrow. It was a product of the grand ambition, the American belief that we can build anything, solve anything, and engineer our way out of any constraint. But there is one constraint we cannot engineer away: gravity. Gravity is the silent character in this story. It is patient. It is fair. It treats a king the same as a factory worker. It treats a canoe the same as a steamship. It does not read the inspection certificates. It does not care about the profit margins. It only cares about the math. We build our towers high. We build our ships wide. We push the limits of our materials. We tell ourselves that we have mastered the physical world. But the Eastland is there to remind us. We are only guests here. We exist by the grace of forces we cannot bribe or charm. We walk on a wire, and most of the time we don't look down. The ship is gone. The bodies are dust. The names are fading from the stone. But the weight remains. The river flows on, moving slowly toward the Mississippi, toward the Gulf, toward the ocean. It carries the memory of the mud. It carries the memory of the steel. And it whispers the final lesson of the Eastland, a lesson as true today as it was on that sunny July morning. You can ignore the physics. You can ignore the warnings. You can ignore the weight. But eventually everything falls.